Welcome back to the channel, folks. In this entry, we'll be taking a look at the villain of Knives Out, which of necessity will entail us going into spoiler territory. So if you haven't seen the murder mystery yet, you might wish to skip this one. But for the rest of you still here, while the film is full of characters who are guilty of unethical practices, including infidelity, fraud, general entitlement, and snobbery, there is mainly one character who can undisputedly be labeled as malevolent, that being the culprit of Hugh Ransom Drysdale. A deceiving and conniving schemer, Ransom was the end result of a materialistic desire combined with a cunning mind that almost allowed him to get off scot-free from the heinous crime of murder, a crime so craftily plotted that if not for a coincidental mistake, would have escaped the arm of the law and accomplished its nefarious purpose. As the grandson of the renowned author Harlan Thrombey, Ransom must have lived a luxurious life since he was young. However, it was likely a childhood that involved absentee parents, as his mother Linda was likely to be rather occupied with developing her own business. There is a chance that Richard might have taken on more of the role of a caregiver for Ransom, but given their prenuptial agreement, we can assume that he was likely diligent in his own line of work as well, out of the fear of being left destitute in the event of their divorce or her death. Perhaps it is here that Ransom's upbringing went awry. Being the grandson of a wealthy family whose parents were too busy to give him optimal guidance, this absence was only quelled by the one thing they always had an abundance of: money, with Ransom having life handed to him on a silver platter and anything that his heart desired granted to him. If Harlan's lavish treatment towards his own children is of any indication, then it's suggestible that he would have been rather generous with his own grandson as well, a trend which Linda and Richard might have also emulated with their own son. And as you can imagine, a young and impressionable mind exposed to such wealthy treatment would likely to grow up into a rather spoilt and entitled brat, and that is the state we find the adult Ransom in, a lazy individual who has never worked a job in his life, save for a summer spent as Harlan's research assistant. Being rich would hardly be considered a bane by many, but there is much growth in character that is afforded by hardship, not the least of which is empathy for the plight of others, as well as the general principle that life doesn't owe you anything. We see that having a cushioned life hasn't done much for Ransom's maturity, as he is rather an abrasive personality, labeled as the black sheep of the family, and undoubtedly responsible for much family grievance and drama. From his interactions with them, Ransom appears to be all too familiar with harsh verbal criticism, which he deflects with his defense mechanism of a jovial expression, serving to convey that he couldn't care less about their comments and infuriates them further. Beyond already being accustomed to the notion of easy wealth, a fact demonstrated by his accommodation in a designer department located near a forest, together with his vintage automobile and expensive clothes, Ransom has also the driver of pain serving to keep him fixated on his grandfather's wealth. Seeing firsthand the effects of an unbalanced power ratio in his own father and mother, Ransom is all too familiar with the fear of being cut off from his monetary source, a fear which grips his own father, Richard, due to his prenuptial agreement with Linda. Ransom isn't fully opposed to the idea of building something of his own, but at the same time he is quick to point out the hypocrisy of Linda, her notion of building her business from the ground up when a major contribution to her success was the $1 million loan from Harlan. Ransom's fear would soon become a reality when Harlan has a change of heart and decides to amend his will to exclude his family. Now, of course, Harlan's fortune is his, and he is well within his rights to do whatever he wishes with his wealth. And besides, while it was the harsh thing to do, Harlan had noble intentions in wanting his family to be able to stand for themselves without relying on his silver spoon. But at the same time, Harlan's act of cutting off his family was hardly a gracious thing to do. Again, while Harlan may not owe his family anything, he has a duty as their father to nurture and guide them in their development. Their faults as children are his failure as a father, and Harlan himself attests to this when he regretfully confesses to Marta that perhaps whatever he's done for his family was to keep them beneath him. While spoiling them was the wrong thing to do, I'm not so sure if pulling the rug out from under his children and unceremoniously severing them from his will was the tactful solution. If anything, it was an overcompensation that would do more harm than good. As his flesh and blood, it's reasonable that they would expect to at least receive some portion of his assets upon his passing. That's just how the societal norms have been. Of course, if Harlan and his children were on sour terms, then it wouldn't come as a surprise if he left them nothing as an insult. But we see that's not the case, and while his children may have flaws, he is still on quite good terms with them, even celebrating his recent birthday with them. Depriving them of the inheritance they've been implicitly promised all their life would be a huge shock. Giving it to Marta was an even bigger slap in the face, a jaw-dropping decision which would undoubtedly cause even more resentment amongst his children, as any reasonable bystander would assume that there was something fishy going on between the two of them, which then puts a target on her. It might have even been better if Harlan had simply donated all his wealth to charity instead of bequeathing it to Marta. To top it off, in a state of folly, Harlan makes the untactful mistake of declaring the changed will to Ransom directly. Of course, Ransom's reaction is way out of proportion as well, and very strongly hints at some antisocial personality traits on his end. The fact that he would callously write off his grandfather, who is perhaps the family member that is closest to him, in a brief moment's decision for the sake of his inheritance. Not once after the act did Ransom show any sign of remorse or grief over the fact that he had put a price label on the life of his grandfather. What may have dampened his sense of guilt is the degree of separation of himself from the act. While he switched the vials, he wasn't the one administrating them, and he was absent from the scene as well, not needing to look Harlan in the eye as he took his final breath. Harlan's wealth may be on the forefront of Ransom's mind, but it's likely that this wasn't just a calculated decision based on numbers. If push came to shove, it's possible that Ransom might have been able to pick himself up and make something of his own name. Linda appears to be quite well off financially still, and perhaps Ransom could have secured a loan from her to jumpstart his own business, just as she did with Harlan. Rather, it's likely there were some feelings of rejection faced by Ransom as well, feelings that quickly bred resentment and rage. As what other conclusion can one derive when you've been abruptly cut off from an inheritance that has been hanging over you all your life, and to make things worse, is now willed to a nurse that your grandfather has only known for a brief period of time? Ransom's reaction, however, gives us a glimpse into his issues with anger and how prone he is to being swept by its influence, with him confessing to Marta that he could have killed Harlan upon hearing the news of the changed will. This homicidal tendency again surfaces at the end, when he mistakenly decides that he has nothing left to lose and tries to end Marta, when in reality it would leave him to rot in jail for a longer sentence. Being powerless to change the will, Ransom has only one legal recourse: to arrange it such that Marta would be ineligible to receive the inheritance. As to how Ransom would have decided on the Slayer rule remains a mystery, possibly a simple Google search just like how Joni did. But what speaks to his craftiness, though, and to how much he is an opportunist, is Ransom's ability to adapt the rule to Marta's specific scenario, framing it such that Marta was responsible for Harlan's demise, and then secretly hiring Blunk to expose the deed. Following the death of Harlan, Ransom displays a remarkable ability to adapt to the challenges after Fran blackmails him out of his suspicious visit to Harlan's study, and the realization that the Slayer rule cannot be taken into effect. In his effort to come out on top, Ransom plays the part of the fake confidant, and in a show of duplicity, he manipulates Marta to his side, convincing her to give him his share in return for his help. It must have been a moment that required tremendous self-restraint, looking face to face at the person deemed responsible for stealing his family's inheritance, as we find that Ransom has been burning with jealous rage against Marta all the while. Given that Ransom was already willing to write off his closest family member, it's no surprise that he would be willing to write off others to continue his pursuit of his inheritance, which we see in the murder of Fran in an attempt to keep his crime concealed. His own mantra of "in for a penny, in for a pound" perhaps best describes his approach, an approach that will stop at nothing to acquire what he deems is rightfully his, even if it adds crime upon crime. In all his misdeeds, he attempted to take the lives of 3 people and was successful in 2 of them, the death of Harlan still indirectly attributed to him at the end. A conniving and callous murderer whose self-interest for a life of luxury led him down the path of villainy.